Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Trey Grayson. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics. We're glad to have everybody here. Tonight's forum is the first of a many series of discussions and panels and things here at the Kennedy School on the Middle East Project, and Meghan will tell you more about that. We're also pleased tonight to have the Harvard Alumni Association as a co-sponsor, so we hope that we have a lot of alums in the audience as well as watching the stream on the internet to talk about a really important issue, Syria and what's going on there and what we can do to make it a better situation. Tonight's panel is going to be moderated by former IOP fellow and Harvard Kennedy School professor Meghan O'Sullivan. Meghan is the Jeane Kirkpatrick Professor of Practice of International Affairs, and she will introduce the rest of the panel. So please join me in welcoming Meghan.
Good evening, and let me join and welcome you all here tonight. I think Syria is one of those topics that can pack the forum in more than twice in a week or two. It's good to see you all and to see many familiar faces. Tonight we have an excellent opportunity to talk about a very complex and important issue. I have three experts who I'm about to introduce you to, and I have heard them speak and read their work and know that they will bring you the best analysis and analysis of the possible prescriptions. But before I do that, I wanted to build on what Trey said, that tonight is also a special evening in the sense it is the first public event of the Middle East Security Project, which is a new program that I am co-chairing with one of my favorite colleagues, Shai Feldman, who is sitting here in the front. Through this program, we intend to bring more public discussions of this nature on various issues related to the Middle East. So I look forward to getting many of you involved in that in the future. So we're going to dig in because there's a lot to discuss, but let me just say a word or two about each of our panelists. You have a pamphlet with their full bio, so I'll be brief. First, immediately to my left, we have Joseph Bahout, who is a professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Sciences Po in Paris, and he made the journey here to be with us today. Welcome. We have Mona Yacoubian, who is a senior advisor for the Middle East program at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. She is also an expert on Syria and Lebanon and working on democratization in the Arab world, so welcome. And furthest to my left is Fred Hof, who is now a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council at the Rafik Hariri Center. Fred, until very recently, was working in the Obama administration at the rank of ambassador, where he was in charge of political transition in Syria. He's also worked on the Middle East peace process with George Mitchell, and we're pleased to have him today as well. So I thought what I would do is begin. We're going to try to make this a conversation of sorts. I would begin by just asking the panel to lay the groundwork for us a bit. What is the situation in Syria? Are we looking at a situation on the ground where there's actually a stalemate going on? Does Assad really have the upper hand? Or maybe Assad's apparent willingness to turn over his chemical weapons and avoid a military strike suggests that he was weaker than the international community thought. Just if, Mona, maybe I'll turn to you and ask, could you just give us a sense of the situation on the ground?
Sure, thank you. Why don't I first start by just giving some of the statistics of where Syria is today. We're now 2.5 years into this conflict. It's come at an enormous human cost, 110,000 people killed, more than 2 million refugees outside the country, 4.5 million people internally displaced. So basically fully a third of Syria's population has been displaced by this conflict. The conflict started as peaceful protests along with the other Arab uprisings, but rather quickly morphed into an armed uprising. And I would say today it is a sectarian civil war. My sense is the situation on the ground is one of stalemate. The regime has certainly consolidated control over certain parts of the country, Damascus and out to the coast. But in the northeastern part of the country, you have Kurds who are essentially now ruling with semi, if not full, autonomy. And then you have swaths of the countryside in the north and the east that are under the sway of a variety of rebel groups. So while the regime has consolidated some control, there are others that have control. There are other parts of the country. And I think at this point, it's very difficult to say that one or the other would prevail. I think we really are in a situation that is going to be a protracted military stalemate, perhaps for years.
Great, thank you for that.
May I just chime in
Sure.
on the current situation? Because I think there's one thing going on that is really important to appreciate in order to get a good picture of what's happening in Syria. We had this incident back on August 21st that everybody's familiar with, the chemical attack in the suburbs of Damascus. That is the tip, the very tip of a very ugly and dangerous iceberg beneath the surface in Syria. Right now in Syria, there is very little going on that resembles conventional combat between military units firing and maneuvering. You'll read occasionally about a village being taken or an air base overrun, but there is very little of that's going on right now. The bulk of the iceberg is a deliberate program by the Assad regime to use its artillery, its air force, its rockets, and its Scud missiles against populated areas that it's unable to occupy and control. And we'll get into this later, but I personally think this is the biggest obstacle to getting into some kind of a political track to resolve all of this.
So, Fred, let me ask you to build on that. You and Mona have described the situation, and I want to ask you to answer the question that I think most or many Americans still have, which is, well, this is a tragic conflict, but what are American interests here? When President Obama was making his case for tactical military strikes, he really focused on the violation of an international norm. But are there more national security interests at stake from an American perspective?
Well, I think there are. I mean, the president, for understandable reasons, focused almost exclusively on the tip of the iceberg over the last month. These chemical attacks. A couple of months before, he was asked on the Charlie Rose show, of all places, what is the American interest here? And basically, he responded, well, we have a very serious national interest, national security interest, in the effect all of this is having on American allies and friends in the region. And we're talking obviously about Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey in particular. So in terms of sort of conventional national security interests, allies and friends being flooded with terrified, impoverished refugees running for their lives because of this program of attacking populated areas, that's important. Others would say that there is a responsibility to protect in a case of mass murder like this. That's a little bit more difficult a case, I think. But our UN ambassador, Sam Power, in her landmark book about this, A Problem from Hell, where she looked at case studies from the 20th century, how does the United States react to cases of mass murder in faraway places? It invariably takes presidential leadership to convince people this is the right thing to do. And that's actually been done in the past in places like Kosovo, where American allies and friends were not directly threatened by the violence that was taking place.
Thank you. Joseph, I wouldn't ask you to count the ways in which this affects American interests, but perhaps you would like to speak from a French perspective, or originally being from Lebanon, a Lebanese perspective. Could you say a little bit more, build on what Fred has said about the regional implications? What's happening to Lebanon, to Iraq, to Jordan? These are really critical questions.
You know, Meghan, it has, I think, become now common sense to say that, or to consider that Syria's crisis is no more Syria crisis. It's a regional and maybe quasi-planetarian crisis today. So in fact, effects are really spilling over, and the longer this crisis drags on, probably the graver and the severer these effects will be. Now, in the immediate environment, if you can say, you mentioned Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, etc. Of course, I won't go down the list, but let's say that probably the most directly touched countries in terms of potential flaring up of violence, of conflict, are most probably Iraq and Lebanon, just because, in fact, these two countries were already in a situation of dormant, rampant civil war before the Syria crisis and before the Arab revolutions in general. Both countries have a very strong Shia-Sunni tension on the fault line of sectarian division. Lebanon, I mean, everybody knows the implication of Hezbollah in Syria, probably of some other jihadis from the other side. In Iraq, the Maliki government is today openly one of the main supports of the Assad regime. So these two countries, if the situation drags on, are potentially annexes, appendices to the Syrian civil war. Now, less directly, probably, Turkey and Jordan are front runners to be, let's say, victims of that conflict, at least because something we should mention more, the humanitarian plight of the refugees. Mona mentioned 7 million, I think, 7 million Syrian displaced, 4 million of which are regional displaced, I mean, to Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, and etc. In Jordan, this is a very touchy situation, where in a country where already there are several Palestinians, where the Jordanians, quote unquote, are a minority. In Turkey, this crisis is also provoking some unexpected problems. Of course, the Kurdish problem is one, but also the Alevi question will, on the road, be a more and more vivid question, i.e. the Alevi/Alawi in Syria. It's not the same, but this is an extension, and it could pose a problem. So this is to say that the region is today really a powder keg. That is really threatening to flare up if things drags on. Now, it remains to say that, I mean, there's an elephant in the room here, the effect on Israel. We never mentioned the effect on Israel, but so far, of course, Israel has managed to keep itself at bay from that issue. However, we must not forget that in the last 3 months, the Israeli Air Force conducted 4 or 5 raids on convoys, on weapons stocks in Syria, and etc. So Israel is also watching the situation very closely. If I may add in 2 seconds, planetary or international effects also to that. I mean, beyond the immediate region, beyond these 4 or 5 countries that are surrounding Syria, I think the effects of the Syria's crisis are also corrosive and very, very dramatic. They are corrosive for the entire region, because first of all, this issue has become now a complete proxy war between Iran on the one hand, Turkey on the other, Iran on the one hand, the Gulf states on the other, and probably Iran and the rest. I mean, part of the nuclear standoff between Iran and the Western community is today played in Syria. Second effect, if the Syria situation drags on, radicalism in the region will also increase very dramatically, the flow of jihadis and etc. And thirdly, on the international effect, and I'll stop there, we have also very severe effects, at least, I mean, the ones that Fred Hof alluded to, i.e., if nothing is done to stop this endless bloodshed, I think a lot of tyrants, of dictators in the world, and some of them, I mean, some of the deposed Arab dictators today must think that over. I mean, Mubarak in his bed, or Ben Ali in Riyadh, are probably saying, if we would have held on, I mean, probably we would be still in power today. And this is a terrible, I think, lesson to all dictators in the world. It is eroding very much the idea of deterrence, on the idea of international norm, the idea of responsibility to protect. And this, I think, for people who care for international studies and international affairs, is something to be thoroughly reflected upon.
Great, thank you. Let's talk for a minute about the August 21st chemical weapons attack, which someone noted today was at least the 14th chemical weapons attack that Assad perpetuated, or that occurred in Syria at least. Mona, let me ask you, the focus has really shifted to chemical weapons, disarming the Syrian regime of chemical weapons. Have we lost something in narrowing that focus? Has this made Assad a much stronger actor? I now think that in many ways he is the interlocutor with the international community. And is there any way that there's a silver lining that we can parlay this deal on chemical weapons into something more meaningful for the Syrians who continue to suffer the sorts of actions that Fred outlined?
Right. Well, I think it's too soon to tell, frankly, whether Assad is a winner or a loser in this. Certainly, in the short term, he has managed to avert a missile strike. He has managed to now insert himself or be part of, although not directly with the United States, a negotiation. There is the implied assumption that he will be in power, at least through the duration of when this chemical weapons agreement is actually implemented. And of course, there are huge questions about that. Will the weapons agreement be fully implemented? What happens if Assad doesn't comply? Is this simply a delay tactic? All very valid questions. And I think in some ways, if in fact the weapons agreement fails, and there are no follow-on consequences, then clearly he will emerge from this stronger. The other side of this, though, is that if, in fact, this agreement between the United States and Russia paves the way toward a broader diplomatic process, negotiations process on Syria, that could actually represent a very important turning point. I think what has been said all along, there's lots of divisions about what to do in Syria, what's the best kind of intervention. But one point on which there is consensus is that ultimately Syria needs to be resolved through a negotiated settlement. So the jury is out. Can this very small opening toward diplomacy be pushed and tested and moved successfully toward a more serious negotiation that includes not only Russia but possibly Iran and others? I think, time will tell.
I think, we have this tendency to look at this as potentially a positive development because we have actually Russia and America on the same page for the first time in the Syrian conflict. But then, when we look at Russia's actions and its rhetoric, there's not as much really to give us hope that Russia has turned the corner or is looking at things differently. Fred, how do you look at this? Do you think that a political solution, and I'll want to get the take of Joseph as well, but is a political solution possible? Can we hope for what Mona described?
Yeah, it's possible, Megan. I think under current circumstances, it's not very likely. I mean, we have the President of the United States, and I suspect every leader of Western Europe saying that there's only one way forward for Syria, and that's for a negotiated solution. War cannot settle anything here. Okay? There's only one problem with that analysis. Russia, Iran, and the regime itself are not buying it. Okay? We have a President of the United States who said something that I think we all hope is true. He said it at the UN today. The Cold War is over. Okay? I would feel much better about that assertion if I were absolutely sure that Vladimir Putin shared in it. And I'm not at all sure of that. Look, on the chemical agreement, at the end of the day, if all of Syria's chemical arsenal is moved out and destroyed, 23 million Syrians, all Jordanians, all Lebanese, all Turks, all Iraqis will stand up and applaud. There is nothing wrong with that per se. Taking out of the hands of a guy who actually used this stuff against civilians. There's not a thing wrong with that. The issue is, as Mona indicates, can a bridge be built? Can we move from the tip of the iceberg to the iceberg itself? John Kerry, Sergei Lavrov, his Russian counterpart, are going to be meeting this Saturday to explore that, to see if there's a way to get to a Geneva conference. But my sense is they may spend their time talking about the date, who's going to be invited, the agenda, the shape of the table. They need to be
People really talk about these things.
Yeah, they need to be looking at the iceberg, because unless that thing starts to melt, there'll be no basis for any kind of a successful negotiation.
Joseph, what's your take on this?
I will jump on that. Two things. I think we have to separate the chemical issue, the chemical chapter, and the political process that would lead to a political solution in Syria. Now, of course, they have been articulated, luckily, lately, but I think that this articulation is still a very theoretical and conceptual one. First of all, on the chemical. First of all, I don't think the Russians and the Americans see eye to eye on that issue. They, of course, agreed to treat the chemical issue in Syria, but they are not talking about the same thing. The Russian leadership is still saying until today that the chemical weapons or the chemical things were used by the rebels, whereby even the UN report, which is in fact agreed upon by the Russians, is implying that this is a regime utilization. So this is the first disagreement that we should sort out very quickly between the Americans and the Russians. Second, my guess, and I mean, let's think 2 seconds that without this electroshock that has been the use of chemical weapons on the 21st of August, we had in fact forgotten the political solution in Syria. Geneva II was completely on the shelf. It was completely in limbo. Okay, thanks to Assad, I'm very ironic here, things have moved and we are talking again about a political solution. But the problem, and this is my skepticism, my second point of skepticism, we are talking only about solving the chemical weapons issue, as if the issue of Syria since the 15th of March of 2011 is a disarmament problem like SALT or START. We are not at all in the same context. This is a revolution that Assad and others have transformed into a civil bloodshed and then into a regional conundrum. And now we are talking about a very tippy point, which is the chemical weapons. Now, having said that, so even the chemical by itself is not thoroughly and sufficiently and efficiently addressed, because we are not in fact talking about the real issue of chemicals. Just one footnote on that. The UN resolution that is supposed to frame the agreement between the Russians and the Americans and the international community and Syria is still not written. I mean, Chapter 7 is refused. Every allusion to sanctions, not to mention use of force, is refused, and etc., etc. So we are very far from the beginning of a result on that issue. Now, if this, which is already very hypothetical, can lead us to a political solution, this is fine. But here again, my fear is that on Syria, we have become much prisoners of several mantras and cliches and etc. So everybody now says, and it is more than politically correct, it is true that there's no solution to Syria but a political solution. That's fine. That's fine. And this is wishable, because a brutal fall down of Bashar al-Assad tonight would lead Syria to probably a butchery. Retributions between Alawis and Kurds and Sunnis and fights between jihadists themselves and rebels and etc. Okay, but having said that, let's put the light on 2 points. What does it mean, a political solution in Syria? What are the contours of a political solution? Is it the ousting of Assad by peaceful means? If I read well the Geneva II text and subtext, this is it. But as Fred said, this is not in the Russian, nor in the Iranian, not to say not in the regime's software. Second, is a political solution a kind of decentralized Syria that will address the Kurdish issue, the Alawi issue, the Druze issue, the minorities issue? Is it put on the table? This is a second hypothetical question. Who will negotiate in Geneva too? I mean, the Russians are still saying, we will choose the opposition factions that will go to Geneva too. And they mention ministers or public figures that are more or less co-opted by the Assad regime. So this is a set of questions. And lastly, how to reach Geneva II and the political solution. We all know by now, and I won't go into details here, that this regime so far, since November 1970, not since March 2011, but since Hafiz al-Assad's father took power in Syria and then Bashar al-Assad in 2000, this regime has never really negotiated if there was no pistol on its head. I mean, the only time this regime has accepted to negotiate, and even though he reverted the negotiation to its benefit along the road, was 1 or 2 times under strong military pressure. So I think that having said all that, political solution is desirable and nothing else is doable in Syria. But unfortunately, I don't see the contours of this political solution, the definition of this political solution, and I really don't see how we will reach this political solution unless this chemical electroshock is the trigger to that. But as I said, it is still very, very, very insufficient so far.
You know, if Mona or Fred, you'd like to add to that? I think Joseph has really highlighted, you know, what is it that we're wishing for? I think the chemical weapons, although it's very complicated, at least it's somewhat in a box. We know what we're looking for there. It's hard to know, what do we want in the political outcome in Syria?
If I could jump in, I mean, I think Joe's points are all very well taken, and he's sketched out quite well the many, many challenges and the difficulties of this. But I think if you think about where we were even 10 days ago or a little more than that, the fact that we have an agreement between the United States and Russia, the fact that the Syrians have actually met the first milestone by handing over the list of where all of their sites are, et cetera, it's notable in a conflict in which for 2.5 years there was zero consensus in the international community, particularly between the United States and Russia. It's important to be skeptical, it's important to test, no question about it. But I think if you look at the trajectory of the Syrian conflict, in the absence of some broader strategy in which diplomacy plays a key role, you are looking at years, as I'd noted from the outset, of conflict. Neither side, neither the regime nor the opposition, has the ability to prevail militarily. You have civilians that are caught in the middle of that. I would maybe take a little bit of issue with the way Fred characterizes it, because it's not simply a regime, which is no question horrific in the kinds of tactics it uses, but there are also abuses that are being undertaken by rebels, and those are documented by the United Nations as well. And so we're in this situation that, if left to its own devices, really spells years more suffering and bloodshed. So my argument is, if there's the possibility to somehow shift the paradigm, to somehow shift the dynamic on the ground, we need to be looking for that, whether via diplomacy, possibly with the credible threat of the use of force, which I think no doubt played a role in getting us to where we are today, and possibly even in the limited use of force. But to think about those tools without a broader strategy, I think is folly. And so I think to be naysaying all of what's happening with Russia and Iran, we may lose out on a very important opportunity.
We're going to turn to, I'm going to ask you a question, Fred. We're going to turn to the audience in a few minutes, but there's one issue I want to get in a little bit, which follows directly on from this. What should the international community be doing? If we all want to get to a political solution, but Mona, as you suggested, there are many paths there, or there are many components to a successful path there. Fred, could you say a little bit about what we should be doing? I know there's a little bit of a difference of opinion on this stage about the question of arming the rebels, and I'd like to surface that before we turn open to some outside questions.
let me start very briefly by just saying that the question you asked, what is it we want? This is kind of a central question, isn't it? I left the Syria business in the State Department almost exactly 1 year ago. Okay? I will tell you, during my time in the U.S. government, and I just came in 2009 to help out George Mitchell initially, I saw no evidence of any systematic methodology to define the objectives of the United States or to create a strategy for implementing those objectives. I think part of the answer to your question is for the United States of America to do its homework on this and to start operating a national security system that makes sense. Now, Susan Rice has come into this job. She has spent some quality time with two former successful practitioners, Colin Powell and Brent Scowcroft, trying to establish a system that replaces hunches, that replaces, last-minute zigzags like we saw recently when the president very abruptly, on the basis of no interagency deliberation, decided to take this question to Congress. Whether you agree with that or not, the methodology was horrible. The president says, oh, I'm being criticized on style points. No, it's much more. It's much more than that. It's about how the business of national security affairs is done. I think what we ought to be focusing on now, this is mainly a matter for the United States and Russia. Russia has some leverage with Assad. I think that when Mr. Kerry gets together with his Russian counterpart this weekend, he ought to be saying, look, if this is going to go anywhere, you've got to go in to your client and tell him to knock off the mass terror campaign. Stop bombing, strafing, and shelling civilians. Because unless we Russians hear from Lakhdar Brahimi, the UN Special Envoy, that you're cooperating with him, until we hear from Brahimi, you get nothing from us. Nothing. Whether it's under contract or not. No weaponry, no ammunition, no political cover in the United Nations. I think it's an opportunity for John Kerry to find out just how serious Moscow is in all of this, to find out whether or not this chemical thing was just a ploy to get Assad to put the chemicals back in his holster and get on with the business of winning the war in Syria. So I think that's really the priority that's staring us right in the face.
I'm going to turn that into a little advertisement for the Kennedy School. We try to make this point that actually process matters. Process really counts. The information you put into a process, the way you analyze it, the people in the room matter, and what you get out is really affected by that. I'm going to open it up to questions. I think Joseph wants to make a comment on that, but please, I encourage you to line up at one of the microphones, and then we'll turn to the audience. Would you like to make a comment as people are gathering?
I'll take the opportunity of questions to do my comment.
Great. I will start up in the balcony there, and I think we all know the rules. Please identify yourself, number one. Number two, please keep your question short. And number three, please have your question end in a question mark. So please.
Hi, my name is Madeline Lear. I am a freshman at the college and a member of the JFK Junior Forum Committee. On behalf of the committee, I'm going to be asking the official Twitter question of the evening, which is, what are the roles of national governments, international organizations, and nonprofits in solving a humanitarian crisis? In terms of Syria, which sector can have the most impact, especially considering the particular barriers, i.e. Congress not yet green-lighting limited airstrikes?
Great. And please don't be shy. There's time and room for lots of questions, so I look forward to more. Who would like to take a stab at that? Mona, do you?
That's a great question. It was actually what I was going to say should be our short-term priority, is to do everything we can to alleviate human suffering in Syria. And here, humanitarian organizations, NGOs, relief organizations have a huge role to play. There are two big issues. One is resources, and the second is access. And so the United Nations has issued the largest appeal, I think, in its history. It's over $5 billion. It is only, I think, maybe 30% funded. So the United States is actually the largest donor. We've now funded, I think it's nearly $1.5 billion in humanitarian assistance. More needs to be done by others in the international community to bring resources into this, and in particular, Gulf countries. The Gulf countries that have a lot of resources at hand. They have used a lot of resources in terms of arming. Qatar, in particular, has done a lot with respect to arming, but has done very little with respect to the provision of financial resources for humanitarian assistance. The second, much trickier question has to do with access, because money that's funded through resources that come through UN channels have to go through government-controlled areas. And of course, there are many, many people suffering who are outside of those regions. There have been efforts that are being done by the US and others very quietly to flow aid and assistance into those areas that are beyond the regime's control. But it's not nearly enough. It's not nearly, the flows are not consistent. And so much more needs to be done, and ideally, frankly, through the UN Security Council to negotiate and ensure that there is much more assistance flowing to where it needs to go. And one quick thing, just one quick addendum to that, by next month, UN inspectors, if this US-Russian plan continues, will be going into Syria to actually inspect the sites. They will need to travel within the country to get to various sites. There will need to be just even short-term tactical ceasefires in order for them to get where they need to go. One idea would be whether those ceasefires can be also utilized to help flow aid and assistance into people that need to get it.
Could I just add one quick addendum to that? First of all, as American taxpayers, I sincerely think we can be proud of what our administration has done in terms of trying to organize and fund humanitarian relief. The work of American NGOs, even people somehow getting inside Syria now and then, is absolutely stunning. It's stupendous. But I would just make one plea. Don't forget what's driving this humanitarian crisis. The International Independent Commission of Inquiry recently made a report. You can get it publicly. They made it to the Human Rights Council. Read that report, and you will get an idea of what's happening. A comprehensive Assad regime program to target civilians. Are there members of the opposition with blood on their hands? Yes. This commission named 3 jihadist groups. 3 groups with al-Qaeda connections. So let's not make the error of using the same brush to tar the regime and the opposition. It's the regime and units affiliated with al-Qaeda that are neck deep in the business of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And that's what's driving this problem.
You wanted to chime in as well on this issue?
Yeah, briefly. In fact, I would like to add a political dimension to what Mona said, and of course Fred, but I fully agree. But the political dimension is the following. We tend to forget that, in fact, groups and nebulous like al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, ISIS, and etc. flourish on this kind of sand. In fact, they flourish on this, I mean, how do you say, on devastated areas, on disempowered communities, and etc. So on the top of the mere humanitarian necessity of helping refugees and coming to assist what we call the liberated areas in Syria, there is a political calculus here. Let me just give you one example. In Lebanon, in the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, the irresistible rise of Hezbollah started because this very clever political movement knew how to enter into or to introduce itself in the vacuums left over by the political power and the Lebanese states. The rise of Hezbollah very exactly began in 1987, I think, when Hezbollah's engineers opened the road in the Bekaa Valley that were completely closed by snow. And since then, Hezbollah transformed, besides its political apparatus and besides its military apparatus, into a very huge welfare state system. So the same is done today in the liberated area. Second point, when an area is lost by the regime, and this is, I think you all know it, and Fred probably knows it better than all of us, when a region is lost by the regime, the tactics of Bashar al-Assad's forces is to completely devastate this region with scuds and etc. What's the calculus behind it? It's to shut down, break down, completely destroy hospitals, schools, dispensaries, and etc. People there are left with the rebels in these regions, rebels unable to provide any basic service, and then the propaganda of the regime says, okay, you wanted to be liberated by these rebels? See what they are getting you. See what they are providing to you. And in fact, these people are not able to provide anything. This is why when, and here, I mean, the French experience is interesting, when the French encouraged, for instance, local councils in Raqqa, in Idlib, in etc., to do elections in order to provide for themselves governing bodies, of course, the radicals won the elections because they had the money and they had the service providing. So if we want to curb these people, we have also to step into that game. It's not only the weaponry and etc., it is also humanitarian assistance that will create an eviction effect to these groups. And this is a political, let us say, necessity and not only a humanitarian necessity.
I hope we continue to get into that idea about is it possible to really support a less sectarian opposition? But let me turn back to our questioners up in the balcony.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jenny. I'm a sophomore at the college. And Mona, I know you mentioned that there's a broad consensus that out of this conflict comes some sort of settlement negotiation. And I was wondering if any or all of you could give more of a picture of the kind of groups within Syria that should be sitting at that negotiation table, and what kind of picture, however vague, you can provide of what kind of Syria comes out of that negotiation.
Should I direct that to you, Joseph, in terms of maybe you've had the most recent contact with the opposition groups, but I know everyone here could.
I'm not sure, but I could say something along these lines, especially that it has to do with the remark I didn't do at the end of the session. In fact, this is a very tricky question. As I said before, I still have a problem, and I think a lot of people have a problem with the definition of the contours of a political solution. But here I think we should, if we want to be intellectually honest, which is not always the case in politics, but also politically effective, to get back to the root of that issue. That issue began with a popular, let's say, uprising. Okay, now we can discuss about the quotas and how much percentage was it and etc., asking for the end of a very classical authoritarian rule as you know it in your PSPA 201 courses here in JFK. So this was the beginning of the story. And these people asked for simple things: the end of the emergency state, the end of the Ba'ath Party monopoly over political life, the end of mafia system crony capitalism embodied by Bashar al-Assad cousin, Rami Makhlouf, the end of the preeminence and uncheckable rule of the mukhabarat and etc., etc. I mean, all the line is very familiar to us and to you. Now, if we have to get back to that, I think that it is embodied in the sixth, if I'm not mistaken, Fred, you will correct me, in the sixth point of the Brahimi / Annan, let's say, blueprint, which is in fact the very famous magical word or sentence saying, we have to form a transitory government agreed by the two parties that will have full executive power, and this is the underline, full executive power over the security services and the armed forces, leading to a transition, leading to free and fair elections and etc. Underlining, or the subtext, is that Bashar al-Assad and his, let us say, clique will exit smoothly from power and gain, as a quid pro quo for that, an amnesty and safe, let us say, safe exit, which is already very much for a man who is, by all standards, a war criminal. Okay, this doesn't answer your question so far. The answer to your question is, and here is probably where we could agree, the three of us, the shortcomings of the opposition. Now, removing Assad from power is something very important. However, and Mona alluded to that, and I fully agree with that, the Syrian issue is not only a matter of authoritarian regime or a mafia clique ruling Syria over helpless Syrians, but it is also, and this is where the civil war narrative has partly something of truth, there is also a problem of accommodation of several, let us say, political / sectarian / ethnic components in tomorrow's Syria. And this is where probably, if I want to be a bit severe with the Syrian opposition, I think the main shortcoming of their homework is that they so far didn't address something critical. If Assad is removed tonight from power, will the Alawi community consider that it is more or less safeguarded? What kinds of guarantees will it ask? And here is the Russian, I think, importance, because the Russian and maybe the Iranians one day could be the guarantors of such an agreement, something along maybe a reconciliation conference in post-Syria and etc., something maybe along federalist lines and etc., I don't know. But what I know for sure is that so far, and this is probably the main reproach I would do to the Syrian opposition, they have not really seriously and frankly, let us say, sketched out these contours, because they are obnubilated today by the necessity and the severity of stopping the violence and stopping the shelling on their heads. So I just want to stress this issue. I think that without answering the Alawi question, and behind the Alawi question, the question of components of the Syrian society, minorities like the Kurds, the Druze, the Christians, and etc., of course, Assad will still have a leverage and will still be able to tell the world, it is me or the rule of the majority, i.e. the rule of bearded bad guys and etc., however and whatever wrong this statement is.
Let me turn right to the main floor.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jafar Akabi. I'm a graduate student at the Kennedy School. I have two questions, one very narrow and one quite broad. The very narrow question is this. About a week ago, the Daily Telegraph, British newspaper, reported a study from IHS Jeane, which is a defense consulting company. They're saying that approximately a half of the rebels are actually al-Qaeda, jihadist, Islamists. So while I sympathize massively with the view that this did start very much as a peaceful protest against Assad, my question is, do you genuinely believe that this remains to be the case today, or is it, as this defense consultancy believes, now become much more a fundamental problem with al-Qaeda, a significant, if not a dominant player amongst the opposition? My broader question is one where I hope to ask all of you to reflect on the Arab Spring as a whole. I've become quite pessimistic. I've seen in Bahrain the crushing of an opposition movement. I've seen in Egypt essentially the restoration of a government dominated by the military. I see what's happening in Syria. I see Saudi Arabia funding so many groups and movements, the most authoritarian regime in the region, untouched. Do you believe that essentially the Arab Spring has failed, or are you more optimistic? Do you see it maybe as parallel with Europe in 1848, where you had revolutions crushed, but eventually a decade or so, a few decades later, you had democracy following on?
Thank you, Jafar, for that very, very narrow question. We still have many questions, but this is a good one, so I'll just ask you to maybe comment briefly.
Yeah, if you like, I'll comment on the narrow question because I don't do too well with.
And Mona, I'll let you comment on the broad
Okay.
question.
Yeah, I'm aware of the Jeane study. There are other studies out there. There's a study that we're about to unveil at the Atlantic Council on the 27th that comes to a strikingly different conclusion. But there is no doubt the influence of jihadist, al-Qaeda type elements in Syria has grown. Remember back to March 2011, when this thing was a peaceful protest, when none of these elements were in Syria. Bashar al-Assad was telling the world, I have no problem with Syrians. I got a problem with the United States, with Israel, and with the al-Qaeda people supported by the United States and Israel. Okay? Over time, Bashar al-Assad has managed to add some flesh to the bones of that corrupt and untruthful argument that he made. Let's not forget where al-Qaeda in Iraq came from. Starting in 2003, the Assad regime began to facilitate and expedite the travel of terrorists arriving in Damascus across Syria into Iraq. This is al-Qaeda in Iraq. Their mission in those days, kill Iraqi Shia, kill Americans whenever you can get a chance. Very, very tight connections between the Assad regime and these elements. Okay? Bear in mind, this is Bashar al-Assad's enemy of choice. Bear in mind, these connections go back over 10 years. Is it impossible to think that these connections may still exist? Mona and I had the dubious pleasure a few weeks ago of testifying before the House Armed Services Committee. What struck me more than anything else was about a half dozen members of that committee, Democrats and Republicans, this was not a partisan thing, Democrats and Republicans basically treating us to the view that, well, you know, it's just one terrorist versus another. It's just Assad against al-Qaeda. Let Allah sort it out. Okay? This is a victory for the Assad regime. This is the objective of their information warfare campaign. Make sure that Americans think that the opposition is just as bad as we are. Then we can win. But Jane's is onto something, the influence is rising, and it's largely a function of our failure to support people who have a different point of view entirely.
Mona, on the broad question?
Yes, just one quick point on the narrow one as well, because it actually connects directly to Jenny's excellent question before, and that is this. I do think we are seeing a continued fracturing of groups on the ground in Syria. I do think empirically we can map mounting extremism. There is also a broad spectrum. There are jihadists on the one hand who have a transnational vision of that Syria is should be part of a transnational caliphate. There are, though, more radical nationalists with a much more extremist view of Islam, Salafist Islamists, who also make up a nice chunk of the rebel groups on the ground in Syria. You would be hard-pressed, I think, to find rebels with a strictly secular view. I think they are a distinct minority. And indeed, just today, there was a statement issued in which a number of groups, ranging from al-Qaeda types to ones that associate with the FSA, a more moderate grouping of rebels, who disavow completely the political opposition the Syrian Opposition Coalition, and call for Sharia law. And what all of this means is, at a minimum, the rebel groups are divided and fractious, and it's going to be very difficult to know whomever sits at that table in Geneva, should we get there, is able to, in fact, control and influence the many groups that are proliferating on the ground. Very quickly on the big question, because it's a great question. My sense is that I don't use the term Arab Spring, I think it's Arab uprisings, that this is part of a generations-long transformation. And it is very difficult to look across the sweep of countries that have undergone change in the Arab world today and feel hopeful. The stories of counter-revolution, of upheaval, et cetera, unfortunately are in the forefront. However, I do believe you cannot have decades of authoritarian rule and then see democracy and free markets springing up over the course of 2 or 3 years. The social contract that pertained in the Arab world for those decades has been undone in many places. But what is to replace it has yet to be built.
Great. We have about 10 more minutes, and I'm going to get these 3 questions, these people who have stood patiently. So let me start down here.
Hi, excuse me. Hi, I'm asking this question on behalf of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Committee. Is there anything that I can do as a student here in the United States to end the bloodshed, or as we say, that's the title of this forum? Is there any humanitarian relief that I can donate to, or is there anything that I can facilitate? I'm just purely curious. Thank you.
Great. Oh, good question. What can the person who's unaffiliated do to end the bloodshed? Any ideas, suggestions?
I would say one thing you could do is, and you probably do a lot of this online, figure out what kind of locally based NGOs are doing humanitarian work in Syrian refugee camps and in Syria itself, and see if you can give them some time here in Boston. I suspect such groups exist here. There is a large Arab American community here, and I think if I were in your position, and I kind of wish I were, I think that's what I'd be doing.
Great. Joseph?
I find this question quite admirable. I would say that besides, the simplest thing, which is giving donations to humanitarian associations or foundations or etc. that work on the ground, I think there is a very, very urgent issue that has to do with Syrian children. Among the 7 million displaced today, more than half of them are below 20 years. 20-year-olds. And these people are a generation that will most probably become, besides the deviances that you can imagine, will become probably much driven towards violence and political violence. And then we ask, where do jihadis and etc. come from? It comes from there. Just to give you one example or 2 illustrations, the Zaatari camp in Jordan, is an open-air camp, and when you know the winters in Jordan, you can imagine what I'm talking about, of almost 1 million people. When you look at the picture of that camp from the air, it is amazing. You think you're on Mars or on the moon. Zaatari today is the 3rd or 4th Jordanian city, and it is a camp in the open. If, for instance, you have time, as I had the chance this summer, to go there for less than a week to do some courses to children or to people there, and just to try to provide them and to offer them something else that what they live day by day, this is something great. Let me give you another gloomy picture from Lebanon, where also I was this summer. In Lebanon today, you have, besides the normal mendicity in the streets of 10-year-old boys and etc. When you talk to medical doctors at AUB, at American University Hospital and etc., they tell you that they are witnessing every day tremendous number of abortion for young Syrian girls below the age of 16 and 15 who are forced to prostitute themselves for sums that I don't even want to mention here, okay? Because this sum make a family, an entire family live. So this is what we are talking about. It's not only Russia and the US and chemical weapons and politics. This is what Syria, I dare to say, I'm sorry if I be blunt, but this is what Bashar al-Assad has created, not only in Syria, but in the region. So I really admire your question, but I would probably encourage you to work along these lines. I think education, childcare is something tremendously important for Syria tomorrow. If you give me 1 minute.
But I'm not going to.
Okay. Great.
At least not at the moment.
Answers that.
I'm going to go up to the balcony and ask for this very patient woman to make her question.
Thank you so much. My name is Dina. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I was wondering, it seems like the national discourse here in the States seems to focus a lot on short-term policy in Syria. How do we deter chemical weapons? How do we stop the killing, humanitarian, military aid, etc.? What seems to be blatantly missing, and what I was hoping you can comment on, is what should our long-term strategy be for Syria, U.S. policy specifically?
I'm going to give that to Fred since
Sure.
he made some
Sure.
cutting remarks about that.
Yeah, I think we've got basically 3 national security objectives we want to accomplish. We want an end to the mass slaughter, for sure. Not only for humanitarian purposes, but because what it's doing to our allies and friends. We want the Assad regime gone, right? I mean, what else did the president say on August 18th, 2011? But Bashar al-Assad should step aside. Now, I'm kind of a 20th century guy. I come from a tradition where when the President of the United States says something like that, it becomes the job of the United States government to make it happen. The President doesn't issue advisory opinions. He's not a second lieutenant at happy hour at the officers' club just issuing his opinions about international affairs. But just as important as getting rid of Assad is seeing that he is replaced by something civilized, something constitutional, something that emphasizes citizenship, something that's not sectarian, something that addresses the problems that both Joseph and Mona have very eloquently addressed. Those are the objectives. The strategy obviously has to do with building up as best we can a non-sectarian opposition. Yes, there are times when those people seem to be overwhelmed by the regime on one side and the al-Qaeda jihadist criminals on the other. But why is that? Why is that? Might it have something to do with our national sense of skepticism over whether or not there's really anything the United States can get right in that part of the world? Is it any miracle that a group deprived of resources while they watch the kinds of resources that are lavished on Bashar al-Assad and on al-Qaeda types, is it any miracle that they kind of get marginalized and jammed? So working with them, helping this opposition establish an alternate government inside Syria, because without that, what is the alternative, really, that we're asking Syrians to accept? Right? There's virtually nobody in Syria who has any respect for Bashar al-Assad. People have no illusions about the corruption, the brutality, the incompetence. No illusion at all. But a lot of people, including my closest Syrian friends, have a real question. What's the alternative? This is the devil we know. Is it possible there's another devil that's even worse? We can't be in a position anymore as Americans to subcontract this kind of thing, pardon me for saying so, to Saudis, Qataris, Kuwaitis, and others. They've got their own narrow sets of interests. We can't subcontract. We've got to get our hands dirty. We've got to get in the middle of it. No silver bullets, no easy answers. It's going to be very, very, very tough. But it's going to require that Americans get used to being involved in complex operational matters again.
Thank you. And our last questioner, please.
Hi, thank you. My name is Andrew Watkins. I'm a graduate student at Harvard's Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Ambassador Hof earlier this evening framed the question of America's interest in the conflict in Syria as one of concern and attention and respect paid to our allies' interests. And you've just now mentioned our need to get our hands dirty and to not subcontract, so to speak, the problem to our regional allies. My question for all the panelists is, we have seen, at least in the media and in the coverage of this issue, perhaps a new prominence in regional players in not only financial backing, but in the roles played by Qatar, by not only Saudi Arabia, but by Turkey and by others. My question is, are we looking at a new dynamic of regional nation states and ruling parties in how they contribute to what may have previously been a great power negotiation over the Syrian question? And whether we are or not, how does the United States specifically and more generally, how do international institutions come to a negotiating table if new roles and new boundaries and new contributions must be considered by previously minor states?
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to comment on that or make a last comment. So Fred, I'll start with you and move down. You can comment more broadly than this.
I think it's obvious in this Syria matter that regional states and frankly the allies and friends I was referring to when I gave that little spiel had to do with countries that are on the receiving end of tsunami-like flows of refugees. I wasn't referring to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and those. But there is no doubt that at least in the Syria context, a hands-off role by the United States has put others in the driver's seat, for better or worse. Now, I must say at the beginning of this, when I was in the State Department, I was one of those who said, you know, the last thing we want to do here is put American fingerprints all over this. This is a Syrian revolution. Syrians, should make connections with others in the Arab world and drive on. It became pretty clear after time that that was going to be the wrong medicine. All right? If you talk to Saudis, Qataris, Turks, and others, the one theme that comes across consistently is, where is the United States? Has the United States just abdicated? I don't know that Syria is the wave of the future for the role of the United States. President Obama continues to refer to the United States as the indispensable nation. I think he's absolutely right. Now what we need is a foreign policy that lives up to that label.
Mona, last thoughts?
Yeah, very quickly. First, I think proxy wars, of course, are nothing new in the Middle East. And for quite some time, Lebanon was the arena for those kinds of proxy battles. It's now Syria, and in many ways it's supercharged as a result because of Syria's geostrategic importance and because of the changes that are washing over the region. So that's the first point. I don't necessarily think we're seeing something new. But the second point is, I think you rightly, by noting the various roles, underscore that the solution to Syria, by definition, has to include and bring around, in my opinion, the negotiating table, these regional powers. I do think the United States and Russia have a key role to play in convening and in ideally being the catalyst for understanding and figuring out what a new regional security architecture is going to look like. There are some who are concerned that what we are seeing in Syria is nothing less than the dissolution of the post-Ottoman order that had pertained through the 20th century. It may well be that that's what we're looking at. It's not clear. What is clear is that no solution will come without all of these players, and I would include Iran in that, being part and parcel of broad discussions and negotiations of how to place this very troubled region onto a trajectory that ideally puts it in a place of peace and stability.
Last word to you, Joseph.
First of all, I think I alluded in my first commentary. I tried to develop the idea that Syria is today the ring or the scene for a proxy war. Mona used the Lebanese metaphor. Just to remind you, since we are in an academic cynical, the fabulous book by Patrick Seal, not on Assad, the struggle for the Middle East, but the first Patrick Seal book on the struggle for Syria. Syria in the 50s and the 60s was exactly the way it is today without the bloodshed. It was the ring of projection for power play between the Saudis, the Hashemites in Jordan, in Iraq, the Americans, the French, the British, and etc. So it is today, again, what it is. The problem is that Syria today is the scene of projection of proxy wars, and it's also the diffusion, let's say, the generator of violence for the region. So it's in and out, it's out, in, and in, out. And this is maybe the difference, and this is maybe the urgency of the Syrian question. Second point, very quickly, because you said it, and I fully agree. I think if we have to today draw some lessons from what's happening in the Levant since 2003, let's say, before the Arab revolutions, with the invasion of Iraq, but mainly with the Arab revolutions, I think that we are unraveling and probably finishing to turn an entire page of political, sociological, economic, intellectual history in the Arab East. I think that the Sykes-Picot, let's say, software is today probably vanishing in front of our eyes. To be replaced by what, I don't know. We are in a kind of Gramscian parenthesis, where something is dying, something new is unborn, and monsters are appearing in between. This is exactly the Gramsci metaphor. And this is exactly what's happening in the Middle East. And if I mentioned a political solution in Syria that would cater for Kurdish rights, Alawi rights, and etc., if I would have said that 2 years ago, probably people here would have jumped to me and tell me this is against Arab national ideas and etc. I think the Arab revolutions have completely achieved several taboos in that region. And I think that you mentioned, something important, boundaries. Even boundaries are today put into question. Without telling you something new, Iraq is today a quasi-partitioned or federal state. Sudan is partitioned. Syria is de facto partitioned. Lebanon today, more and more people dare to say, politicians dare to say, let's address the federal issue or a kind of political formula that would accommodate diversity and etc. Egypt is probably one day will be forced to address this issue to accommodate diversity, etc., etc., etc. And of course, Libya. And the third point, and it goes back to the broad question on culture and etc., like the Arab revolutions are ending an era politically and economically and geographically, geopolitically, I think it is ending an era culturally and in terms of mindset. I completely agree with you. This is a generation-long process. It will be bumpy, sinuous, reversible, but very long and very painful for the people who are living there. So if something has to be done by the West or the rest or whatever you want to call it, is to first of all try to understand what's happening without dictating and etc. Try to accompany what's happening and try to alleviate more or less the sufferings, human and other, that are happening in that region and that are going to be very long. I come from Europe. I come from the Middle East and then to Europe. Europe is much closer than the US to that region than you are. And I mean, at least in terms of inflow of immigrants, we have to begin from now to address the issue of what's happening in the Arab world. At some kilometers to the south of France, Spain, and Italy, and etc., this is something that we have to learn to live with for not only 2 or 3 years to come, but for decades to come. So I think that we have to begin recreating our own software to accompany the new software that is being crafted in the Arab world today.
Thank you. Well, I think that you'll all agree with me. We've had an extraordinary conversation. Obviously, there are many more issues. I'm the lucky one. I get to have dinner with the 3 people up here, so I get to continue this conversation. But like many conversations we've had about Syria over the last weeks and months, it's not entirely uplifting. But I do think it's been unusual in the sense that several points of clarity at least have come out for me. And so I'd like you to join me in thanking our 3 panelists for joining us tonight. And let me wish you all a good evening. Thank you.